Hi, everyone. Welcome to another segment on Chapter 10. And in this segment, we're going to look at perfect competition, that market structure, and compare it to monopoly. And we actually draw a graph showing the equilibrium solution in perfect competition, and then the comparable solution in monopoly, and really just compare the price differences and the quantity output differences. And then since we know there are monopolies out there, and we've discussed in the previous section problems or criticisms of monopolies, here we're going to bring up a few points that help us defend monopolies. So let's take a look at that. Okay, let's start this by taking a look at some basic observations. We'll just state these things, and then we'll take a look at the graph and show how some of them actually happen. So perfect competition versus monopoly. Well, unlike perfectly competitive firms, monopolies can charge higher prices, and they do. And that one most people will accept right away because monopolists have price control, as we said and showed earlier. And since they're the only producer producing that commodity, they may tend to charge higher prices. So that one makes some intuitive sense, but we'll show it on a graph as well. And the second observation is they produce lower outputs. That one people don't initially accept as easily, because why wouldn't a monopolist produce as much as it can? It's the only one producing the product, so it could sell all of it and make more profits, right? And that argument isn't sound because we looked at the demand curve and showed that the monopolist has to lower price to produce more outputs, and they don't want to lower price too much because they'll end up on that inelastic portion of the demand curve where their total revenue starts falling off. So they'll end up producing lower outputs than the perfectly competitive solution might give us. And also these outputs are below economic capacity. In perfect competition at economic capacity, all the firms are producing at the lowest average total cost. So it's an efficient use of resources. They're at their lowest average total cost. However, with monopolies, they don't have to end up producing at the lowest average total cost. So they're producing below economic capacity and therefore producing at an inefficient spot. And the last observation we make is the monopolists can make economic profits in the short run, well, just like perfect competition, but monopolists can make economic profits in the long run as well. And that's due to those barriers to entry that prevent other firms from coming in and competing with monopolists. So let's take a look at a diagram of this and show some of these observations. So we begin this by looking at only the demand and the supply curve. So we're looking at the perfectly competitive solution because we're only looking at the demand curve right here. I'll override it in blue. So there's our demand curve, underline the D. And remember, demand is equal to average revenue. You can get the price off of that curve, and that is the average revenue. And we are looking at only the supply curve. So this is the industry, the demand and the supply curve in perfect competition. It's the industry. Okay, so where demand and supply intersect, that's got to be the perfectly competitive solution, right? We're looking at the tricky part here is understand that this is the perfectly competitive industry. It's not one particular firm, it's the whole industry. What solution would we have? And it's just like our normal demand and supply diagrams. We find the equilibrium, it's right there, where demand and supply cross, and we find out that the perfectly competitive output is 60. So that's the output you'd get in perfect competition. And we go across and we find the price of 6. That's the price that would come out in a perfectly competitive industry. So that's how we start. We're looking at the perfect competitive industry. And then we take it a step further and say, well, what if this was actually a monopolist industry? So you can start by thinking, well, it's 100 small little mushroom farms outside of Vancouver, and one company comes along and buys them all up, so it becomes a monopolist. So the first solution we had was the perfectly competitive solution. And now if a monopolist comes along and buys this, well, that supply curve we know is all the little marginal cost curves. So we now say this supply curve is the marginal cost curve, and we come down and we say this demand curve and average revenue, that's the industry demand curve. But remember, the monopolist looks and faces the whole industry. So that's the demand curve that the monopolist will look at. And what's further, once we have that downward sloping demand curve, What falls out is a downward sloping marginal revenue curve for the monopolist. So that's the first kind of tricky point we have to see here. There's our marginal revenue curve for the monopolist. Okay, now if you go back, we've looked at this many, many times. The first thing you have to do is find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost to see what quantity this firm's going to produce. Sure, it's a monopolist, but it doesn't matter. We want to find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and that's right there. Here's our marginal cost curve. I'm pointing at it. And there's our marginal revenue curve. I'm pointing at it. So that will give us the optimal quantity. And we go down and find the optimal quantity that the monopolist wants to produce is right there. That's the monopoly output of 40. Okay, what price can the monopolist charge? Well, if we look at the demand curve, average revenue curve, remember, I often kind of refer to that as the price line. And that's because from this quantity, we keep going up past that intersection all the way up to see what the market would be willing to pay for that quantity. And that comes off the demand curve. So we come back here and the monopolist smiles and says, I can charge 8 for this output. So that's the monopoly price. Often this is shown as PM for price monopoly and QM for quantity monopoly. Okay, so what we've been able to show from here, I'll put it in lime green, is that the competitive output went from 60 down to 40. So there was a decrease in quantity produced. And what happened to the price? Well, when the monopolist took over, the price could go up to 8. So when you compare perfect competition and monopoly, it's easy to see that the competitive output from perfect competition is bigger and the competitive price is lower than the monopolist. Okay, so that confirms two solutions. Now, this isn't always necessarily going to be the case. There's always extenuating circumstances that might change this, but the basic argument here is sound, and that's the one that we use in this course for the standard solution. If a monopolist is compared to a perfectly competitive situation, the monopolist will charge a higher price and will have a lower output. So this example on the slides is an exact example of what we just covered. So we want to compare perfect competition and monopoly. So if this is a competitive market, what is the equilibrium price and quantity? Well, that's where demand and supply cross each other. So right there, the equilibrium quantity would be 300 units per period, and the equilibrium price would be 30. Now, if a monopolist takes over, then this black line falls out, and that black line is the marginal revenue curve for the monopolist, and the supply curve becomes the marginal cost curve for the monopolist. So they have to find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost to find their optimum quantity. There's where marginal revenue equals marginal cost at an optimal quantity of 200. How do we find the price? Well, we go up to the price line. Well, really, it's the demand curve. We continue our extension from 200 all the way up to the demand curve and then go across horizontally to the price. So it shows that the equilibrium or the price that the monopolist would charge would be 40 and the quantity the monopolist would produce is 200. So notice that the quantity went from 300 down to 200 when we looked at the monopolist solution, but the price went from 30 up to 40 when we looked at the monopolist solution. So given we've got these two dilemmas where the monopolist will produce less and charge more, why do we still allow monopolists to exist? And there's a few reasons to defend and allow the existence of monopolies. These are those. Firstly, they capture large economies of scale. So that's one thing we didn't show in that slide, but you could make an argument that some monopolists would capture huge economies of scale. And as you know, that means lower and lower and lower long-run average costs of production. So some of that can be passed off in lower prices and higher quantities. So in some cases, monopolists are able to capture large economies of scale and end up passing some of those savings on to consumers in lower prices. The other thing is because they have these maintained profits in the long run, they can get into extensive research and development. So they can look into new techniques of production, new products, better products, products that consumers will want more efficient products, because they have these high profits that allow them to do so. They have this extra cash, extra profit to look into this stuff for the betterment of society, perhaps, and often. But some critics say they might just not want to improve things or improve technology because it might allow other competitors easier access into their market, and that might hurt them. So they might hold off from doing something like that. And they might hold off from introducing new products, even if they're more efficient products, because the new products might be cheaper and longer lasting. So that won't help their business model. But eventually these things do happen. And the overall observation is that they engage in research and development for the betterment of society because they're allowed or because they exist as monopolists and have these extra profits. And the last thing, which is really good news for smart SAIT students, is they can attract high quality staff because they offer high wages, good working conditions, good locations, good hours, maybe flexible hours, things like that. Because they have this extra profit that they maintain in the long run, they can put that into higher salaries if they want, or greater benefits. Like I said, that's good for smart SAIT students and other business students that graduate and get out and work for monopolists. So that's it for this section. In the next segment, we're going to look onto discussing different types of monopolists, different types of monopolies specifically. And then we're going to look at ways that the government can control monopolies and maybe make them look a little bit more like the perfectly competitive optimal solution. And we'll see you when we get there.